Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
Alrighty, folks, what's going on? This is Matt here for Dark One Linux Tech Gamers, the fusion of Linux technology and gaming. And we are looking at JayzTwoCents' follow-up video for his Gaming on Linux. Hasn't been great so far. To his journey into Linux gaming and trying it, shall we say. Jay, I didn't really give too much flack for on his video because he's not claiming to be an LTT or, as far as the approach. So he comes into it as haven't touched this in forever. Just, very, I can appreciative of his, I'm a Windows power user, but Linux isn't my thing. Don't know it as well. So I can appreciate that kind of approach because at least you understand where they're coming from, whereas opposed to like LTT, where it was very, I'm a Windows power user, I know what I'm doing, and then you break things and you don't. So let's get into what Jay is doing on this follow-up video and see what he's got to say.
So it's been a couple of weeks since we did our Gaming on Linux, or I installed Linux, or whatever title that video is, and we're going to talk about gaming on that today, because obviously with some of the newer titles coming out, and us being curious of what kind of performance hit there is if you were to choose a full-time Linux system over Windows, we're going to talk about that today. So we got some pros, we got some cons, we got some benchmarks, we got some charts, and then we got kind of a twist at the end of this video, so stay tuned. For those looking for a high-end custom gaming experience, look no further than Falcon Northwest. Falcon Northwest has been building PCs made for gamers for over 30 years with a focus on a true high-end gaming experience. Custom cases available only through Falcon Northwest feature state-of-the-art testing and design to ensure that every component is performing at their best through thermal imaging and rigorous lab testing designed and overseen by the Falcon Northwest founder himself. With a complete lineup of systems ranging from small to large, every Falcon Northwest system includes a 3-year warranty policy and a year of 2-way overnight shipping coverage, providing the ultimate peace of mind. To see all that Falcon Northwest has to offer, follow the sponsored link in the description below. Okay, so if you haven't already seen it, we did a video where we installed Bazzite. Bazzite is it's an immutable version of Linux, which means you can't go in and change any of the configurations or any of the kernel files or any of that. It's basically a one-click type of install. If you haven't seen that video and you're curious about how to get it installed, go and watch that. I'll try and link it down below. It's actually very, very simple and it's free, which is the #1 incentive most people have for trying to use something like Linux. Now, Linux has a ton of different builds, a ton of different distros, and it's kind of like a choose your own adventure. You could go with something as simple as Bazzite, which is built specifically for gaming. Like it's built and intended to be a quick, easy install. You don't have to know anything about it, which is what makes the immutable nice. It's built on the foundation of Fedora, which is very well known. It's been around for a long time. It has a huge dev team and dev community behind it with people that are constantly helping make it better. Lots of help to if you guys run into any problems. Foreshadowing, to try and get it up and working if something happens to go wrong with it. In fact, the devs of Bazzite reached out to us and we're very thankful that we even talked about it, and we're very thankful that it exists because we are not power users around here when it comes to Linux. We really do need the idiot's guide to Linux, and Bazzite's a very good place to start there. That's mostly because of the fact that it's an immutable, but an immutable built on a foundation like Fedora gives it kind of like the best of both worlds, where you get a powerful build, but you also get a very simple build where it's very hard to go in there and mess things up. Now, one of the downsides of gaming on Linux is going to be, now specifically from the perspective of Bazzite, I want to make this very clear. When I say Linux in this video, I'm referring to Bazzite. And we're on Bazzite 42 right now. When we installed Bazzite, it was 41, but we updated to 42, which is another positive thing about Bazzite is we're seeing new builds all the time. So I want to make that very clear. If I do happen to say Linux, I'm not doing an all-encompassing ideology. We're talking about Bazzite specifically. So I may slip in.
Oh, Jay, you're going to piss off all the fanboys. Oh my God, you didn't mention the right distro, or Linux is just the kernel idiots. No, you're right. So I appreciate, again, this is why I like Jay's videos specifically, because it's very clear and precise to what he's talking about. He's giving his experience for the demographic that the distro that they chose fits. New users, DIY, kind of want to build your own console, simplified PC experience. That is what he's talking about. The best way to say it is DIY turnkey solutions. They're not drop-in replacements. They are alternatives, but they give you kind of the same end result. So again, I appreciate Jay clarifying this to kind of head off some of the dumb kind of bullshit that'll typically come from the Linux community about, you didn't mention the right distro. It doesn't do this on my distro crowd. He's talking about his experience on this particular area, solely focused on Bazzite. Let's keep going.
I say Linux, know that that's what I mean. But there's a lot of pros to it. One, it's free. It's a quick and easy way to give the middle finger to the establishment of like Microsoft and other OSs that are just all for spy and profit these days. It's very, very compatible with, like, obviously Steam works on it just fine. We showed in that particular video, just about everything works. In fact, I'd gotten some feedback when we showed in our original Bazzite install video that my really old game, my old title from like the early 2000s, called The Movies, which is basically The Sims, kind of like a rebranded Sims, but the whole idea is you're building a but a movie studio and building up your movie studio, wouldn't launch or work. Somebody actually reached out to me and said, hey, the game works. They were, one, surprised anyone else even knew what the game was, let alone the fact that I had it, and two, that I was trying to use it. But what they explained to me was it was actually the video player that wasn't able to play the intro video to the game. He said the game works just fine. It's just you need to install this blah, blah, blah to make the video player compatible with that type of movie file, and then it will work just fine. So it's actually kind of funny that he mentioned that, because I do remember back in the earlier days of a lot of games on Windows and Steam, that was a problem that actually happened on Windows a lot too, where a movie file couldn't play, which would stop the loading of the game. A lot of the time, the workaround for that usually was just to go in and modify the movie file or delete it entirely. It wouldn't try and play it, it would just go right on to the game, and that's still a thing people do today, actually, on games that have very intrusive intro videos that are unskippable. Anyway, I've got off on a tangent, I digress. It's a very well-supported platform. Let's talk about some of the other pros here.
So, okay, I'm of two minds of the free part. The aspect he's talking about is the middle finger to the spy establishment. That part I'm fine with, the control of your system. The kind of dual mention of free, though, is also they're talking price, which is a selling point that I fucking can't stand. As a Linux, speaking as a Linux user, I use a bunch of different Linux systems. I've donated to Chimera OS. I donated to Garuda. I donate to basically the way I approach open source, or FOSS for those purists that want the right terminology. The way I approach these projects, I view them as products, and they're only going to get better if I support them either by being involved or money. And the ones that deserve money, because I can't in some way contribute to the overall development of the project or product, I will pay you so you can either focus on it or somebody else can be brought in to focus on it. That is kind of how I view these projects. So I hate the kind of like dual tone nature of the term free when it comes to the like selling point aspect of it. To me, it's control. You know, they're talking free as in freedom and all the other nonsense, not free as in beer, but free has a very, specifically to the crowd Jade talks to, free has a very, very different connotation than you seem to think, because you are thinking in freedom. They're thinking price. And the crowd they come from, shareware, freeware, all that stuff means lesser than a paid product. And it grates on me when people don't understand that, because their perspective is so skewed to only this perspective, when they're not willing to just turn a little bit to see that this person's point of view is going to be a little bit different because of where their angle's coming from.
FPS hit isn't terrible. Now, some of these notes are actually from Phil, because Phil did pretty much all the testing when it comes to this right here. I did screw around with it quite a bit. I did actually install it at home, but I haven't spent as much time on it as Phil has. Phil also installed it at home on his system, so we can kind of get some some opinions formed on it. Now, the note specifically says, when it works, the FPS hit isn't too bad, but you can't really tell it's not running on Windows. And that's the overall positive experience, especially if you've been trying to game on Linux for a long time, especially when it wasn't nearly as supported. The whole idea of being able to tell that it's not on Windows is a very huge pro for gaming on Linux. Now, one thing I want to talk about right here is our particular build is using an AMD graphics card. We're using the reference design, like the AMD branded 7900 XTX, because AMD still has the best support when it comes to gaming on Linux. It's better than it was before for NVIDIA, but it's not as good as it's been for AMD. And I think part of that is just the open sourceness of AMD over the years has just kind of, not influenced, but it's just sort of bled into the open source community. So obviously when you have something like Linux or any build of Linux, which is pretty much all open source, you kind of get that dual layer or that duality of open source support there, which means you're going to get overall better experience on AMD. Now,
so to his point, he's generically not wrong. Like, there's certain things where AMD is better. So I'll put it this way: out of the box, if you are in current, as in what would be the most mainstream GPU market, and you are in that sphere, you know, a 3060, 4060, whatever that mainstream market. For whatever the Steam survey is saying currently is the mainstream. And you're in the AMD end of the camp, or if you're looking at Linux, I will say the support for AMD is going to be better than NVIDIA, generally speaking. Certain things are just better with AMD. So the out-of-the-box experience for most mainstream consumers would be to go with an AMD system, AMD build, etc., because of that open source nature. Now, what I will say, this is where it's kind of a dual tone thing. The way AMD does the graphics and the CPU support and all that stuff is they pin it to kernels and Mesa releases. So if you're running like super new stuff, sometimes, especially if you're on static distros like an Ubuntu or LTS or, you know, any of those kind of things, they are very not as new hardware supported kind of thing. So it's kind of a duality with AMD. The saying they age like a fine wine in Linux isn't actually far off, because I've seen people still running like Radeon 7s and stuff that are, you know, trying to get everything they can out of a system, whereas NVIDIA generally might not have the best support, but their product generally is at least supported on release day. AMD, fine wine. And so you can buy the new, you know, whatever 10,000 or whatever version of the series they're going with next, and for AMD, and it's just gonna probably not be supported for 3, 6, 12 months. I mean, I have a 7800 XT, and that thing, I didn't get fan curve support for like a year. So, I mean, it's relative to what you're looking for. So day one, I'm going to say it kind of leans on NVIDIA more. And if you're just looking for a more out of the box experience with more like mainstream-ish hardware that's not bleeding edge, you're going to have a better experience with AMD.
Phil's system at home and my system at home are on NVIDIA. And Phil said it's been working pretty good for him at home. Same thing for me. I haven't had any issues with things kind of not working. I really sort of stuck to just my Steam library. And it's the same overall experience. I can't really tell I'm not on Windows when I load into that particular partition that I have Bazzite installed on at home. So that's a huge positive. Also too, it's nice to see that new technologies like FSR, DLSS, and ray tracing are supported on Linux. So that's a nice thing to see, because those were some technologies that we weren't too sure if they were even going to be present in these builds. Remember, we are Linux noobs around here, so you might be like, dude, it's been that way from day one. We don't know. This is literally the noob's perspective of fuck Windows, let's go to Linux and see how it works. So
again, I appreciate the willingness to be like, we're noobs. Ray tracing, FSR, DLSS. So most of the DLS, now this could be getting down to the weeds kind of thing. And it, again, DLSS and RTX and, ray tracing and all that stuff, was hit or miss as far as support. It seems, at least from a NVIDIA end, that kind of got because they supposedly share a lot of their code with Windows for the Linux stuff. They are plugging into more Proton's plugging that RTX DLSS hole, it seems, at least from the back and forth I've seen. I could be totally off base on that. Totally admit it. AMD, let's just say I was playing Ninja Gaiden 2 Black, and oh boy, turn on ray tracing on that, and that tanks the frame rate by a bit. Now, it works. I'm just not saying it works well. But yeah, there is support for it. Whether or not it's good is here's the key: support and good support, two very, very different things.
Seeing those technologies there is a nice thing. It's nice to see. But it's not all rainbows and kittens, all right? So we'll talk about some of the cons right here. The number one thing we've already talked about is multiplayer and anti-cheat. Almost every AAA title that's multiplayer requires anti-cheat. Now, when we talked about that in a previous video, a lot of people reached out to us saying, hey, it's not as bad as you think. There are ways to make this work, but it's gonna get more complicated in the future. And let's use Battlefield 6 as an example. Battlefield 6 uses the Javelin anti-cheat. And one of the things that's unique about Battlefield 6 and the way EA has implemented the anti-cheat is it's the first title we've seen where secure boot is required and virtualized base security, or VBS, is pretty much required to be able to play Battlefield 6 online for sure. That means if you were running Linux, you didn't have access to the open beta, it just wouldn't have worked or launched because your anti-cheat doesn't work on Linux right now. And I say right now because I don't know what kind of workarounds might happen in the future. I also don't know if single player would even be an option for you because it checks all that stuff when it launches the title, not when you try and go online with the title. So you may not even get access to the single player mode because the campaign is apparently back in Battlefield 6.
So Javelin, oh man, yay. One step forward, 10 steps back. EA, so they had support. So as an example, when the Steam Deck was first announced, they had support for Apex on it. And then around the time they started fucking around making Javelin and all this other shit, that's when they pulled support saying it's too complicated. Yet all they had to do was target a specific build of, a Linux system, but God forbid, brain. So, as far as the anti-cheat stuff, it all depends on your flavor of game. It's like anything else. So like, this is the problem I have with some of the critiques sometimes. They don't look at it from the other perspective. So these are Windows guys. Okay, this works on Windows. Would they have the same complaint if it was a Mac? That's where my general critique will always come in from. If you make these complaints about this system because it doesn't do X, Y, or Z. Now, to be fair, the point they're making is you're giving up stuff. And they're not wrong. But are the trade-offs, see, and this is the thing with computing. It's always been the thing with computing. There are trade-offs and compromises that you make for your technological choices. You might not get the latest and greatest. You want the latest and greatest, the trade-off is a high price point. It's all compromise and trade-offs. So the trade-off is, do you expand your library, the scope of your library, more niche titles, more oddball multiplayer games, etc. Or do you stick with the other thing that you complain about, that is, spyware and all the other shit from the other system that you are on? That's up to you to decide. So that is the only general issue I usually take with some of these videos. But developers are on blast for this. Destiny 2, I'm looking at you. Get, running on likes, get banned. Fuck you, Bungie. You already fucked up Destiny as not much as possible anyway. But again, it's all relative to the personal choice and the person willing to make the compromises of where they feel they need to. I'm not going to blast them on that, but on the same note, look at where your other alternatives when you make that comparison, because what would you give up if you went to them? That's all I'm saying.
But it's one of those things where moving forward, that may become more the norm. Now, the irony is that on day one, cheaters were already there, and it was already exposed, and screenshots were already put up of, the anti-cheat or the cheat software working and showing the health bars and locations of every player in the map through all the walls and stuff. And I think that's something that's kind of always going to exist, no matter how much developers think they're trying to squash cheating. Because let's think about, real quick, this is a side tangent of what a multiplayer game is. It is all the information hosted on a server, and all that information also must be sent to each client, including the location of every player. So that's always going to be something that on some level might be able to be sniffed out in the netcode. It's just kind of ironic though, considering the fact that by making that move, by having secure boot and VBS be a requirement, you kind of exclude an entire player base. Like for instance, those that are not on Windows 11, or they may not be on a GPT partition on their drive, or let's say, like I said, Linux users as a whole, all of Linux in this case, not just Bazzite, you exclude them because of those anti-cheat mechanisms. But as you saw, it's not working at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see how they fix that in the future. But if it kind of sets the precedent for future titles to use hardware-based security, then you're going to probably find Linux be completely excluded from these future titles moving forward, which is really going to suck because, it kind of feels like the year of Linux. Hell, even Wendell at Level 1 Tech reached out and was like, hey, if you want to do some Linux stuff or some server stuff, let me know. And I'm all for that. I'm all for maybe even getting him out here and kind of getting us past the entry-level noob perspective of Linux and start becoming more of an intermediate user where we can kind of plug and play modules and things and build an OS how we want it, especially if we find some use case around here where we actually need that. It's kind of hard to need much of a use case past just saying fuck Microsoft, right? That's a pretty good, solid use case, especially with the way Microsoft's Windows is nothing but a data mining platform these days, mining your data for them to sell. One of the notes on here from Phil is friction of troubleshooting why something isn't running when a game doesn't run right out of the box. Par for the course for Linux, but can be a negative for some people. So yeah, it's like I said, not all titles will run, and most titles, almost all titles can be made to run. It's just you're going to have to do legwork, you have to do research, and you're going to have to probably reach out to community to find out why something isn't working. And it's very unlikely that you're experiencing something for the first time that the dedicated Linux community hasn't already experienced and maybe overcome. But yeah, I mean, it's overall been a pretty good experience. Now let's talk about the performance hit, because we know.
Okay, so community. I do love it when they bring this up. It's just like on Windows, there's going to be issues. So 1 second. This is a Surface Book 3, 15-inch, 1660, 32 gigs, 2 terabyte SSD, etc., etc. I have 2 games on here from EA specifically. Now it could be the app, but EA app, Origin, whatever you want to call it, refuse to run. It says that I'm running in a virtualized environment on their hardware. This is one of my few Windows 11 machines. Yeah, no, it's not. So, you are going to run into those issues regardless of platform. I know I have other titles where I have to reg edit shit. There's other titles where I have to edit INI files. There are other titles I've had to, mess around with. There are a plethora of reasons and issues in Windows. The problem that I have with some of these, when they mention it just doesn't work. They push a broad spectrum of saying that it just works on Windows. Bro, no, it doesn't. You're gonna have cases. Look up any game that is either looking for performance issues, launch issues, and you'll find them. I can think of probably 5 games right off the top of my head that have issues just launching in Windows. Now they're older. Some of these are older titles. Syndicate, a Medal of Honor Warfighter. I think it's called was it Drakensong, River of Time, Drakensong River of Time, Time Shift. There are titles that just will not work on Windows at all. So I'm not saying it doesn't happen more frequently on Linux. Frequency is a different scale, but knowing your resources and where to go tends to mitigate a lot of that. So ProtonDB solves a lot of those issues. I know when I was having issues running Heroic and my Shadow of Mordor, there was a Mordor War, Shadow of War wouldn't launch at all. I had to go into use Proton tricks and do some other stuff that I generically hate doing. Experiences have been improved significantly on that stuff, but overall, that one resource solved the problem that wasn't even related to Steam. It was at all, but it was in that resource with that game because of the database that game, the Linux gaming community is built around that. So, Linux tends to be more about knowing where your resources are. Windows is more prevalent, so the resources are more shotgunned around and not as centralized is what I've tend to find. So experiences will vary.
No games today are designed to run on Windows. If we are not talking about a console, like a PlayStation, exclusive title, it is designed to run on a Windows platform. Because obviously the Linux hardware, the hardware in our Linux box is the exact same hardware as many PCs. In fact, it's a dual boot system. We do have a partition for Windows and a partition for Linux, specifically Bazzite. We installed Bazzite 41. It was updated to 42. Oh, and I want to call that out as a negative real quick. One of the things you're going to notice here when we look at the comparison between performance, there are major performance differentials that can happen from driver to driver, specifically on an NVIDIA graphics card, AMD as well. But I want to call out, like, the 50 series NVIDIA graphics drivers have been pretty much a shit show. But I will say the latest 580.88 drivers have been really solid and actually given a noticeable multi-% uplift in performance across the board. So on Linux, you can't just grab a driver and install it. Okay, you gotta back that up. On Bazzite and most immutables, you cannot just grab a driver and install it. The driver for your graphics card is baked into the whole ISO. It's baked into the entire structure of the Linux Bazzite setup. So if you want to update the driver, it basically comes bundled with the entire platform update. So going from Bazzite 41 to 42 got us a later AMD driver. Now you're gonna see builds that are listed as latest or stable. We did stable builds for obvious reasons. So that's to me a bit of a con, where some titles, like let's say for instance, the Javelin problem wasn't there for Linux. Let's say it wasn't a VBS based anti-cheat with secure boot being required. Let's just say the fact that you can't update to the latest driver would have also probably stopped you from being able to play the game until the entire build was updated with at least a driver that meets the minimum requirement for the new title. So I'm sure a lot of people that played the open beta realized right away, like, oh, I gotta update my driver, because the second you launch it, it will tell you you need this driver or newer to be able to even play the beta. That's both for AMD and NVIDIA. If the driver doesn't exist yet in a build, you'll be waiting for that. If the build didn't come out during the few days that the open beta was available, then you don't play it. You aren't playing it at all. Same thing if once the title launches, it'll take time for that title to catch up with whatever, or the build to catch up with whatever drivers necessary for that particular game. You're waiting for that build to exist. So that's one of the downsides with an immutable, which is what Bazzite is. So I'm sure that's something that has an easy workaround if you're running a more open type of Linux build, where you can go in and and modify drivers and such on a kernel level. But with an immutable, you can't do that. So that's one of the downsides to the approach we took to gaming on Linux. So I just wanted to point that out. It's day one support for many new titles is not going to be much of a thing, depending on the popularity probably of that build. Let's go ahead and now talk about gaming performance. I know I've rambled on quite a bit. We didn't do our full run through of our testing because one of the very first things that we noticed, shit, how are we going to capture the information between Linux and Windows? So for instance, we use PresentMon when we do our FPS testing and GPU testing on our dedicated 9800X3D GPU testing rig. PresentMon is it was a side project that became a more main project within Intel. And obviously that works just fine with AMD GPUs, AMD CPUs, NVIDIA GPUs, and Windows. It does not work in Linux. So when we captured the FPS, it's already, even though we have identical hardware with two different OSs, we already have a little bit of variance when it comes to the way we're capturing FPS because Phil had to use Mango HUD in Bazzite to be able to get like a basically FPS overlay and capture and get our averages and our 1% lows and all of that. So that's why you're gonna notice there's no like 5% low, which is what we like to show when we do PresentMon. We can't capture that with Mango HUD. So that's why you're only seeing one.
So Mango HUD is Mango HUD is the main project for the display that you are doing right there. The best way to manage Mango HUD is actually use an app called Goverlay, and you can get and tweak the Mango HUD interface to however the hell you want. Now, Bazzite specifically should, if I remember correctly, have very different ways of doing that within the Steam interface. I could be, the last time I ran Bazzite was as a HTPC for a Atari VCS, but that could be the option. Goverlay would probably be my general recommendation if you want to fine tune your Mango HUD experience.
% and average FPS on this. So again, it was like, the first thing we experienced in even trying to produce this video is, well, crap, how are we going to capture the data? So that's why we don't have as much of a gaming library that we normally would do with GPU reviews here, but it's enough to paint the story at least. Let's go ahead and start with synthetics because it's kind of interesting here. So you'll notice if we look at our chart here, we have Windows 11 24H2, and then we have Bazzite 42. So you can see right here, the pink bar is Linux, or specifically Bazzite, and the blue bar is Windows. You can see there is a pretty large discrepancy between the two. So in Port Royal, we got a 17,090 with our 7900 XTX, and then we got a 13,075 in Bazzite with identical hardware. Now I want to point out too, not all 3D Mark benchmarks work. In fact, Phil even had to do some workarounds just to get like Port Royal and stuff to work. What's interesting though is the fact that both Firestrike Ultra GPU score and Port Royal GPU score, so one is a older rasterization test, one is a newer ray tracing test. They're nearly identical on the score, which is not usually the case. But you can see that it's a 20,064 in Windows versus a 13,402 in Bazzite. Now, if we move over to gaming though, so I want to point out.
Okay. So I have a couple and this is because it's not their normal routine, so I get it. But on the same note, I'm going to kind of flack on this process a bit. He talks about doing workarounds to get stuff to work. What performance costs do those workarounds potentially have? So I'm not saying they're skewed, far from it. But in this case, you want to try to run the identical test as much as possible. Like, isn't that the case? So like I've noticed he has Unigen running in the background. Like Unigen runs across the entire backside. There's a ton of different stuff that is kicking around for benchmarking on Linux, where you can get at least somewhat of a fair comparison. Now, is it going to be some of it going to be using like ray tracing, the newest technologies? No, but like I'm pretty sure like 90% of the Unigine shit works across the board. Was it superposition and all the other stuff? Yeah, Heaven, I know Heaven, Valley, and I'm pretty sure superposition, but all work on Linux. So I'm not saying I find it disingenuous, but if you're talking strictly experience around the box, you're gonna have to not, your control has everything has to be flat for the comparison. So like instead of force feeding Port Royal and Firestrike to work, why wouldn't you use superposition and that stuff instead? At least to make the comparison fair. Again, because again, he talks about workarounds, and I'm not criticizing the information. I'm criticizing the approach because, and I'm not saying this as a Linux fanboy. I would say this when I compare a Mac, any of that kind of stuff. Flat comparisons would, if the hardware is the same, why wouldn't you take the same approach with the software? And at least then, the experience is the same, the installation process is the same, the applications across the board are the same. You're not force feeding trying to install stuff. Now, I'm not questioning the accuracy of the data. I'm questioning the approach of the data. Difference.
Real quick here, we tested 1080p and 1440p. We didn't do 4K, but this paints a pretty solid picture of what the performance hit in something like at least Bazzite is when it comes to Windows. But this shouldn't be that surprising when you see these results here, because most titles are designed for Windows. This is 1080p for gaming. We'll talk about 1440p in a second. Soccer 42, Windows 24 H2 had a 98.6 average FPS and a 58.5. That is a 40 FPS hit. That is, heck, about 40% hit. It is pretty damn close to a 40% hit right there. So that's very noticeable between the two. If we talk about 1% lows, 83.2 versus 32.3. So that is massive right there. So you can see there's the average and the 1% low are much closer together in Windows on that title. And when it comes to the 1% low versus the average, they're a bit farther apart in Linux than they are versus Windows. And that's going to be noticeable when it comes to gaming perceived smoothness and such, as the way you're perceiving the gameplay to feel as you're playing the game. Cyberpunk 2077 though, different story. They're a lot closer together. 93.2 versus an 81.4 for the average. Now this is also the built-in benchmark. I want to point that out. I think one of the reasons why we did the built-in benchmark here is it was quick. It was easy to do, guaranteed back-to-back. That test is not going to be indicative of what actual gameplay is like. I also think the game save may not have been on that system because Phil's using his account for that and not our testing account, which we had here. But it was just an A/B comparison, not to be taken specifically to say this is how the game runs on that title. We just wanted to see performance differentials between the two OSs. So I think that might be why they're a little closer together on that controlled synthetic track built in to Cyberpunk. But an 82.3 versus a 68.5 for minimum FPS. Now that minimum FPS is not to be confused with 1% low. That is like the lowest FPS that was recorded. So they're a lot closer to the average, which means I could assume that track looked a lot smoother than it would have probably if we were in the game itself. Now another title that we like to use around here is Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora. It's a pretty efficient title. It runs pretty good even on lower hardware. It's a beautiful title. Anyway, the Windows. So the Windows build got 140.8 average FPS with a 106.1 1% low versus a 115.3 and a 66.3. So once again, the average and 1% on Bazzite for that title was farther apart than it was on Windows. Although it's still decent now, 115.3, 140 versus 115 is a pretty big performance hit. And then you take the 1% low and put it even farther away from that. 106 versus 66, a 40 FPS difference between 1% low is going to be noticeable. Let's talk about 1440p here.
Okay, so I wanted to kind of finish his graph before I poo-pooed on anything. So the data presentation is fine. I have no issue with like these are the numbers you're coming up with. My question is because it doesn't, from what I'm seeing, Windows 11 versus Bazzite game comparison in FPS, higher is better. So you have an Intel 1470K, 32 gigs, 7900 XT. You're just giving averages of these, but you're not telling the settings you're running these. Are these ultra max settings with ray tracing on and that stuff? If so, there's a lack of how do I say it? Nuanced information that could kind of be left out that could feed into some of this. I don't want to say skew the results, but and I'm not making excuses because I've even admitted ray tracing on AMD on Linux is god fucking awful. But is ray tracing on? Is, are you using like FSR and some of the, frame gen stuff and all the other stuff? Like, I'm curious to know like the methodology for each one of these results. And I think that being presented would be a little more upfront, I guess. So again, I'm not shitting on the information. I'm kind of maybe shitting on the approach, but not so much the approach, just the lack of more detail on that approach is all I'm saying. Like when you do these kind of comparisons, again, I don't care that if Windows is better for it, cool. Windows is better for it. Like Jay mentioned, these are games that were meant for a totally different fucking system. So the fact that they even fucking work is amazing to me, or really anybody. But I would like I think it would be more transparent in the approach that they're taking for these results would be a little bit more helpful when they're presenting them. Just my take.
Pretty much exactly the same story, just lower FPS across the board. I'm not going to sit here and go through all of them with you because it's basically the exact same shape as the 1080p chart. It's just lower because higher resolution. And that shows us by moving the load onto the GPU more and making it less CPU bound. It wasn't even the way the OS was like utilizing the hardware or the CPU or the RAM. It shows by even making it more GPU bound and the shape being the same, it's just the hit you get with the platform. So although it works and the gameplay was smooth, the performance hit is real and it's there. Let's go and talk about some workarounds and something like if you wanted to play a game like Battlefield 6 coming out that is not going to work on Linux and probably isn't going to work on Linux as long as secure boot and VBS are required. And then we'll talk about our latest development on our Bazzite machine and maybe you guys can help us with that. But this is when even the Linux community is starting to say, like on some of these titles, dual boot. Dual boot is not, we don't condone piracy around here. It's one of the reasons why we like the idea of Linux being a free open source thing. There are ways to make Windows work without having to pay for it. That should be pretty obvious. We are not going to show you those ways. We are not going to condone that. However, let's use the whole Stop Killing Games initiative right now as an example. If a studio can say, buying the game is not ownership, you can also quote unquote say, pirating something isn't theft. Okay, now we are tightrope walking some ethics right now, okay? And it's up to you guys to decide. But if you really, really want to play certain titles, there are ways to install Windows and have it fully functional and not cost you a dime. Now, for legal reasons, we're not going to show you how, but you can, and all you have to do is a simple search on how to activate Windows with a script. But with that said, you can now play those titles on Windows, and you didn't give Microsoft your money. Okay. Also, too, we're gonna be doing a video here coming up pretty soon where we're gonna.
Yes, you didn't give Microsoft your money, but you gave them your data. That's the problem. It's still the trade-off.
show you how to remove all telemetry from your Windows build. So none of your data is getting mined and sent off to Microsoft. So stay tuned for that. I think that would be a good counter follow-up to this whole like, screw the big studios kind of a thing. But even when the Linux community itself is saying certain titles, you just have to dual boot for ease of access to, sometimes it can't be helped. If it's made for a certain thing and it has a requirement that cannot be overcome via software, then you have no choice. But with that said, everything was going great until this morning. So here's our Linux box. This is our dual boot box actually. I'm gonna go ahead and boot it for you right now so you can see exactly what we're experiencing. The way it's set up right now is it will provide a list of all the OSs that are installed, but the way it's set right now is rather than booting to a specific one by default, it is going to boot to whatever the last OS that was booted to is. In our instance, that's Bazzite. So if I turn on the system right here, heard a click, there we go. So if you'll watch right here, it's gonna show our different OSs right here. And you'll notice there's two Bazzites. One is the current and then one is a backup. Wait for it. So there we go. We have OS tree 0 and OS tree 1. OS tree 0 is the current install right now, and then 1 would be the backup, technically. But watch what we get. This is what we're getting right now. So we're getting generating run and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, entering emergency mode, exit the shell to continue. We have no idea what this is. Everything was working fine. We even took this with us to ViewSonic and we were gaming on it when we were doing the big DV, the direct LED, direct view LED panel, and everything was fine. And we came back and then we tried to use it again for this video to kind of maybe get some updates and make sure that we're not on another build update for the latest driver. And this is what we were greeted with. So if I go ahead and press Control D right now, failed to connect to system scope, bus via local transport, no such file or directory. It's essentially telling us, hey, you're telling us there's an OS here, but there's no OS here. Now, if we were on that menu, where before it automatically moves forward to go down to OS tree 1, which is the backup, the same thing happens. So it's like somehow the build got corrupted and so did the backup. And we're not entirely sure why that is. Now, if I look at the journal right here, so I can type, press enter for maintenance. I can type journal CTL. This is basically a log. There's kind of like always a running log going here. But if I page down, you'll start to see these red lines. This is where the first stuff starts to go wrong. Static nodes permission, failed to resolve group, audio disk. I don't want to say that word out loud, but I don't know what that, anyway, that's just a bad joke. Failed to resolve group. Look at all this. Unknown group for basically all of the, it's almost like it's all the drivers, to be honest. But I don't know what this is. This is where I say like, Bazzite's perfect for a beginner like us to be like, hey, it installed, it works, and we're up and going. It's bad for anyone that doesn't know Linux or the way that the kernels work to look at this and have any idea what they're looking at. This is where I need your guys' help. In fact, I might even send some screenshots of this to Wendell to be like, bro, something error happened, right? Because that's exactly what I'm seeing right here. Here's another one right here. Failed to start OS tree prepare root.service, OS tree prepare OS. I'm sure the answer's in here, but we have no idea why.
Okay. So what you're seeing, was the interim file system, interim is file system stuff. That is going to be, it can't find, or Grub can't find where it needs to go, which generally you have a Grub issue. So sometimes the pointers or the UUIDs, when a Windows update happens, I don't know if there was a Windows update to this particular system, will nuke the fuck out of Grub to no end. So I'm curious to see if he boots into Windows, what happens. Usually it just kind of tends to work. It's usually when it's more Linux specific, it doesn't work as well. So that sounds like a Windows update bork the Grub menu. So, because the journal CTL stuff is like all the stuff that I'm seeing is all system D related stuff. This is what, honestly, this is why, like, what I will say, if you're going to do a Linux system, make it system specific, pull out any prior drives. You guys have plenty of other drives kicking around. You cannot tell me okay, this box is Linux. I get why they have a Windows drive for this device, but on the same note, you eliminate more problems by pulling that dual boot solution out. And yes, as far as gaming on it and making the recommendation of dual booting, yeah, but like it is what it is. But certain things just don't play well together. Microsoft and Linux bootloaders generally don't play well. I mean, there was one point Microsoft was just nuking Grub to begin with, and like literally, you'd go back to MBR every time. As far as like it would just nuke Grub right off the system from a Windows update. So this sounds like a Grub issue related to specifically a Windows update, honestly. Because it seems like your pointers in Grub are not pointing to where they need to go based on the UUID, if I had to guess, for your partitions and stuff. Because you could probably dig down to like FS check and all the other stuff to and see what you're looking at more specifically. But I would honestly Grub. What is that? I'm trying to remember how, like Grub Rescue is the way to go about searching for it. It's super simple, doesn't take long, but it should kind of fix that issue. But next, I will make the suggestion, Jay. Next time, just have a Linux system, no Windows on it at all. If you're going to do this kind of build stuff, I would have separate hardware, Linux system, Windows system, comparable hardware on both. Now, might not be able to do that for certain reasons. I'm just saying that is the best solution to the problem, not the most ideal. But because the reason I make that recommendation is because it helps you avoid potential problems like this. It's just like mixing drinks, and some drinks just aren't meant to be mixed. So, again, I'm not really crapping on Jay because he does admit they're Linux noobs, and I'm totally fine with people who admit it because they're not passing off their knowledge or their lack thereof in the subject as fact, and I'm okay with that.
So that's where it becomes difficult for us to say, yeah, you should definitely just switch to Linux and screw any other or nuke any other OSs you may have. Like, I would be honest, I would probably consider having a dual boot system with a cracked Windows or a script activated Windows or something. That way when something like this happens, you're not just asked out. Because I'm assuming right now, I'm not going to do anything yet, but I'm assuming right now all our game installs, everything we've done on that OS so far is completely nuked. Like, it's seeming that way because both OS trees are giving us the same behavior. I'm hoping that's not the case, but I'm going to leave it like this until we can get some answers as to why that's happening. Now, to be fair, our other Bazzite build, which, Phil, if you want to turn the camera around, has been running perfectly nonstop with the world's greatest troll, right, on our heaven wall. Has been absolutely rock solid with no problems. The only thing we deal with is because we leave the player going so long, those are just videos playing, they're not actual benchmarks. The player likes to crash every now and then. We just have to restart the OS and then put the players back up and everything's great. So this video had a dramatically different conclusion than what it would have had this not happened. Because I'm telling you right now, as a Linux noob, I have no idea what the hell I'm looking at. And then I already tried to use like ChatGPT and some other AI to help with, hey, here's what it says. The very first thing it says to do doesn't even exist. Like, I can't even get to what it's saying. So yeah, this is where we need your guys' help, especially if you're a Linux expert. What happened? What broke, and is it recoverable? All right, so if you guys have switched to...
Yes, it's recoverable. Generically, again, it's just from what I'm seeing, Windows borked it. Grub got all sorts of confused, and you just need to repoint Grub to where it actually needs to go. That seems to be the issue. Now, it could be a little this is my immutable running on Linux, so I tend to not use immutable distros all that often, besides maybe SteamOS or Bazzite or Chimera, which is very specific. But it looks like it's just a grub Windows update screwed up grub, which is not something we're not used to as Linux users. Now, it could be more than that, but with it being immutable and all the other stuff. But I think, from what it seems like, that just tends to be the issue. And if you can fix that, then no, you haven't lost your games, you haven't lost your data. This is one of the perks of Linux, where everything in Windows is very crammed together. Certain aspects of Linux are very disconnected from one another. Like, they all tie together, but if one breaks, everything else is still here. It's kind of like a car. Just because I lost a wheel doesn't mean I lost the rest of the car. I just lost the wheel. Might have broken some shit along the way, but generically. So, short version of Jay's video, like, I'm not going to shit on the content, the information in the content. I might shit on kind of some of the methodology in the content, or the lack of kind of clarity on some of the results of the information provided. But I appreciate their kind of openness and the way they're looking at it from that noob's perspective, because it tends to be needed, and Linux users tend to brush off the noob approach and the noob users, and they tend to forget that, well, they were noobs at one point. So, I don't know. What are your guys' take? Do you think Jay's an idiot? Do you think his information's good? Do you like Jay? I personally just get a ton of noob viewpoint on this, and it makes me appreciate the content in and of itself. So you guys let me know, what do you think of Jay's approach? Good, bad, indifferent. You guys know what to do. Comment, rate, subscribe, all that fun. Any guy on Patreon and all that crap. I'll catch you guys in the flip. Peace.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.